Hello, and welcome to session 4 of the Is the UK on Track to Adapt to Climate Change Science Policy Conference. My name's Kate Lonsdale, and I'm one of the 2 champions for the UK Climate Resilience Research Programme based at the University of Leeds. So yesterday the focus of the conference was on the state of the climate science and climate impacts. Today we're focusing on adaptation planning and trying to understand the drivers and the limits to this. So this morning's session looked at how likely it was that we can adapt to a 3 degree world and where there might be limits to adaptation from the perspective of a number of key sectors, so flooding and water stress and health, ecosystems and biodiversity. And in this final panel session of the conference, we're exploring what are the governance, awareness, data, cultural and political changes that need to be made to enable the UK to prepare to 3 degrees. So just to add a little context for this session, so yesterday we were reminded by Emma Howard-Boyd that we need to be acting at pace and with urgency in our response to the known risks. But to quote from Paul Watkiss' presentation, something is not working, and this Committee on Climate Change's 2019 report to Parliament emphasise that England is still not prepared for even a 2-degree rise in global temperature, and that many of the national plans and policies still lack a basic acknowledgement of long-term climate change. So this is what we're dealing with. So in this rather ambitious session, we're aiming to cover a range of critical themes that are key to enabling us to respond effectively to a changing climate, and all of which I believe could benefit from a 2-day conference in their own right. But we will, I hope, at least be able to raise some of the key opportunities and barriers and get a sense of whether we're in a good place to adapt to 3 degrees and what the government should be doing and the consequences of not acting early. And we're very lucky to have an informed and distinguished panel to help us do this, and all of whom have been working in this area for more than 20 years. I hope you've been able to see their presentations in advance, and if not, please do look at them afterwards because they contain an awful lot of valuable information. So the panel consists of Professor Nick Pidgeon from Cardiff University, Professor Rob Wilby from Loughborough, Paul Watkiss, who's Director of PWI Associates, and Dr. Amal-Lee Amin from the CDC Group. And the panelists now have 5 minutes each to present some initial thoughts on this topic, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for discussion, questions and answers. And as you're listening to the panelists, I urge you to start adding questions to the Q&A function to get the discussion going. And remember that you can upvote other people's questions if you see something you particularly like and would like to hear an answer to, so we can make sure we have time for it in the discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. No, I'm not going to stop sharing. I'm going to share I'm going to introduce Nick and share his slide. So to start off, to introduce our first speaker, Professor Nick Pidgeon, who's Professor of Environmental Risk and Psychology at Cardiff University. So Nick's Director of the Understanding Risk Research Group at Cardiff University, and amongst many other things, Nick's managed a number of multidisciplinary research projects for research councils on the public perceptions and engagement with climate change risks and sustainability. And he's recently undertaken a survey of British attitudes to climate risks and how they've changed in recent years in collaboration with colleagues at Climate Outreach, and that was done under the UK Climate Resilience Programme. The next presentation focused on public perceptions of dangerous climate change and current levels of awareness and opportunities and barriers to action that relate to this. So over to you, Nick.
Okay, thank you, Kate, and I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to participate in what's been a fascinating event so far, having sat in from the morning yesterday. Just on my talk, and that's on the web there, just to recap a few things briefly. I think we know quite a lot about British and in other European countries' public attitudes to climate change and mitigation, much less about how people see adaptation to the impacts of climate change. It's been an understudied topic over a number of years. Since 2016, we've seen a major rise in concern about climate change amongst the UK public. And since the DEFRA Prepare study, which went out in 2012, 2013, what has happened is actually heat risk has become far more salient to people. Back in 2013, people knew flooding was a major risk for the UK. They do today as well, but heat was nowhere on the agenda. Now people do see heat as an issue. And I know Elmer O'Connell mentioned that this morning from Public Health England, that there's a real communication opportunity there around human health and heat that needs to be picked up. Now, the Resil risk study was conducted in late 2019, and we worried when the pandemic broke out whether climate change had gone down the agenda for people in terms of importance in the public mind. So we've done a short rerun of the survey with a sample of 1,000 in August, and we've established that that's not been the case, and that's consistent with other evidence, both here and from the US and Europe. So there's been no change in principal beliefs since last October. And I think that's actually relates to an issue that Baroness Brown raised this morning. The question, would risk and resilience be higher on the public agenda post-COVID? And I think it will actually, because risk issues ebb and flow in different ways over the years. But it's clear that once society becomes interested in one question, other issues come to the fore as well. So I think one of the unfortunate consequences of the pandemic for this domain in particular is that resilience will be now much higher in the public policy agenda across the board. However, that doesn't mean we're prepared for the impacts of 3 degrees as policymakers or the public. And anecdotally, we do a lot of focus group research in Cardiff, also around climate change and its impacts and potential responses. And people are quite comfortable talking about mitigation options, renewable energy or energy efficiency in the home. But the moment you get onto risk, uncertainty and impacts, and rising temperatures, people become visibly uncomfortable in those meetings. So in fact, it's a different type of discourse, so communicating climate risk is going to be a challenge. We already know from a lot of research in the health and some in the climate domain that actually fear appeals, making stuff look scary without also offering credible solutions, are likely to prompt reactants. Also, there's a temporal dilemma in all of this, which we've been thinking about here in Cardiff. I think David Warrilow summed it up nicely yesterday in his question. So in the next 20 to 30 years, the different concentration pathways don't look very different in their main impacts. So how do you distinguish 2 and 4 degrees, let's say? But beyond that, there's uncertainty on the impacts, which grows. So experts disagree about the precise impacts in a particular location or country. And that's, I think that sets a whole bunch of communication dilemmas about how we get across what 2 and 4 or 3 means to people. So how do we deal with this? Can it be done more effectively? So I've just shown on the slide here and at the end of the talk, and then I will wrap up, some of the ways we've tried to address this. In quite an early study, we used photos here Cardiff, we did one of Italy as well, and maps to show the potential impacts of sea level rise on a particular area, and that did seem to have some impact. In fact, we found from that study that gain frames are better than loss frames. I won't go into the theory of that, but what you're saying is if we invest in flood defences, then we will gain better health and the economy of Cardiff will prosper in the future, rather than if we don't invest in defences, then everything will go underwater. So gain frames are better, but it's complicated. It interacts with emotional impact as well. Narratives are important. You see on the extreme right-hand side, the climate crisis there. And that's something we've used with Resil, but that can be complex. We've already discussed stories earlier in the conference, and probably require more deliberative and in-depth engagement with people. And then you'll see in the middle, we've been, in the Resil study, in fact, we were not very successful in getting this across. We tried to present 2 and 4 degrees in terms of different dimensions, both for the globe and for the UK, to try to get across to people the difference between the two. And actually, we found that quite difficult to do. If you can see sort of people living in areas of significant flood risk, then 2 and 3 million, there's lots of evidence in the psychological literature that people would just see that as a large number of people, and that the difference between the numbers don't make much sense to ordinary people. So there's a genuine dilemma, and I don't think I've got a straightforward answer to that question, in getting across in a rich, narrative, relevant way what higher degrees of warming would mean for the globe and for particular areas or countries like the UK. And the final thing I would say, Baroness Brown talked a little bit about what you could call adaptation deterrence, the idea that if you've got net zero, then maybe that reduces the pedal on adaptation efforts. And that would be a very serious situation were that to be the case. I mean, it was interesting that the recent Citizen Assembly on climate change, I think there was almost no mention of adaptation. I know their focus was net zero, but it would have been interesting to see how that could have been interjected into that conversation. So one suggestion is maybe we should have a Citizens Assembly on climate risk and climate adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That's very helpful. We're now going to move on to Professor Rob Wilby. He's Professor of Hydroclimatic Modelling at Loughborough University, and his research over the last 30 years has been on the management of freshwater and built environments under climate variability and deep uncertainty about the future climate. And he's done a lot of work directly with organisations in government and the water industry, so he takes a very pragmatic approach to his work on climate risk management. So over to you, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm going to start with the very bold assertion that climate change indicators are perhaps our key adaptation asset. Just like the good coach monitors the performance of the athlete in terms of the ups and downs of fitness using a pulse check, and also protects the athlete from undue harm during that really tough track session, so we need to be taking the pulse check of the nation. And I really believe that this sort of statement, monitoring to manage, really helps to crystallize that idea. Of course, indicators can serve a range of purposes. They can help us to evaluate how well we're doing under present climate variability. They can help us to assess the extent to which policies and investments have had intended outcomes. So how well are we doing with existing adaptation measures? They can be a powerful vehicle for communicating in quite targeted ways to constituencies using indicators that make sense to people locally or across different sectors. And I think we also need to look at indicators perhaps in a more holistic way in terms of how we communicate vulnerability more generally. My personal view is that nationally we're in a good place in terms of climate change indicators that track our exposure to climate hazards and threats. We're in a reasonable place in terms of tracking changes in our sensitivity, such as putting more houses in the floodplain, increasing our exposure to flooding and the damages when they occur. But I think the area where we could do a lot more work is in indicators of adaptive capacity, how we measure that both in individual sectors and across connected systems. So 4 examples that I just float here that come to mind is that perhaps we need some more indicators on changing societal behaviours and attitudes. And here I'm thinking about our approach to managing more extreme droughts in the future. One can be to build more reservoirs, more storage, more assets, more connections. The other side is to think about how people's attitudes to water might change during more extreme events. And perhaps as a society, we might accept lower levels of service under very extreme conditions. Yesterday, the point was made that we really need to address the housing stock if we're to adapt to key threats like rising temperatures. So I wonder to what extent we can gather information on the level of upgrading and retrofitting of this huge set of assets that we already have with us, let alone the build that's going to come in the future. We also need to recognise that risks are connected across space and across sectors, so measuring ways in which systems relate to other systems and how the resilience of those connections is changing through time is important too. And one metric, for example, I've been working on with others is how emergency responder times vary during extreme events like floods, and those data are routinely collected and might be used in this context. We could also be thinking about some quite familiar metrics like national food self-sufficiency as an indicator of our vulnerability to disrupted supply chains, not least in terms of food. So can we find other nice measures like that to capture international dependencies? Next slide, please, Kate. So I think what I'd like to do now in the last few minutes is just to capture what would be in my wish list when it comes to monitoring and data. And I think we could all benefit from having essentially a one-stop shop that is collating all of the climate change indicators in one place and putting that in a very appealing public-facing portal. I mean, we already benefit from a long history of collecting and tracking climate change indicators, but I think we can do more to broaden access to this very rich information and data as it tracks our performance through time. Over the summer, we saw that wonderful initiative led by Ed Hawkins seeking to rescue and recover old rainfall records. And I think there's a lot more we can do there to really dig into the archives and extend backwards in time some really important records. Likewise, many of our government agencies hold really huge data sets on all sorts of information related to compliance monitoring, for example, in the water industry or for air quality. And we might be able to combine those data sets and mine them in clever ways to identify locations in the UK which are particularly sensitive to emergent climate signals. And this might help us to rationalize the work as well if we keep watch on those hypersensitive places. Fourthly, we could also be undertaking field programs to really stress test in practice some of the adaptation measures that we're thinking about. And again, one area I've been working in is in terms of the efficacy of tree planting to keep rivers cool. And perhaps we need more programs like that to really test the extent to which different types of intervention work in different locations. And finally, I think we've got a way to go, and I'm sorry I have to keep saying this, to open up our national weather and climate archives to a broader public audience. There are some wonderful tools, as I show here, for example, in the Netherlands, which really enable users to drill into those data sets and explore them in interesting and creative ways, and to thereby meet the local interests and needs that I think many of us have been talking about so far. And with that point, I think I need to take my pulse and calm down. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rob. We're now going to hear from Paul Watkiss, who's Director of PW Associates, which is a research consultancy specialising in adaptation policy, planning, finance and economics, and he has over 20 years of applied adaptation experience. So he's been heavily involved in the CCRA process as the first, the second, and is leading the methodology chapter for the third assessment, CCRA 3. So Paul's presentation very much focused on the governance architecture and evaluation approaches used for adaptation over the last 12 years since the Climate Change Act in 2008. and talks about why we need to change significantly if we're going to adapt to 3 degrees or more. Okay, over to you, Paul. I'll change the slide.
Thank you, Kate, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I've been given a very broad title to talk about evaluation and governance, which is huge. So I'll talk a tiny bit about evaluation, a tiny bit about governance, and a tiny bit about a few other things as well. So I think the starting point is to recognise, as Catherine and Baroness Brown set out this morning, we really do have quite an advanced policy and governance landscape on climate change risks and adaptation in the UK. So, on paper, we look pretty good. Certainly at the national level, you might argue not so much at the regional and the local, but on paper, we should be really leading the way on this. And the other thing that's worth highlighting is we're now on to our 3rd climate change risk assessment and NAP cycle, and that also the adaptation programs of the devolved administrations. So we've been doing this for 12 years, and we have learned some things. So the way that we are structuring the CCRA has changed to try and help us inform and incentivize adaptation. So those are all positives, but as Kate has set out in her opening slide, when we look at what we're doing in terms of our progress, it's disappointing. If this was an end-of-year report, we might say could do better. We might actually go a little bit further than that and say we really need to pull our finger out, especially as we're entering into the 2020s. And this leads to a sort of important question, which is why? Why do we have this differentiation between, on paper, what should be a very good governance framework that leads us to do adaptation and a lack of the action that perhaps we would like to see in practice? And I want to explore the governance element of that. Now, I think the one thing I need to do as a sort of starting point for that is to make it very clear that in the UK, as in most countries, we use a mainstreaming approach for doing adaptation. What does that mean? It means we try and integrate adaptation into existing policies, programs and plans and processes. And that makes it very different to mitigation. Mitigation is a single issue. It can talk in quantitative terms with metrics that work across the economy and across different sectors. And so we don't do that for adaptation. We don't present it as that type of issue, and therefore we have to use the governance and work with what's there already. Mainstreaming has lots of advantages. It also is quite challenging to do, and one of the greatest challenges is around the governance. And I would add that to the list that Baroness Brown put up this morning about one of the reasons why we are being struggling. So as a little bit of fun for this conference, I mean, I do a lot of work and looking at adaptation in different countries. And as part of that, with some work for the OECD, we've sort of got some correlations or success factors that we found when comparing different countries on who were progressing most on good adaptation, or at least implementing some adaptation in practice. And as part of this conference, I've sort of taken those success factors and applied them to the UK over time. I haven't published this. I'm worried that if I do publish this, I may never work for UK government again. But the key thing is to highlight that those success factors include many governance issues. So they include things such as a high-level champion. They include the need for very strong ministries to actually lead on mainstreaming. There's a whole issue around policy and governance entry points, and a large number of issues around cross-sectoral aspects and having the capacity and the governance in departments and not just in one central authority. And the little squiggle on the right-hand side is just a very crude mapping of those success factors. And I think the 2 points that come out very strongly is that, if we do go back to 2008, all our success factors were there, and particularly all the governance success factors were in place. And that what we've seen, particularly at the times when the NAPs have been published, is those success factors have fallen away. And there's a whole range of issues why that is, and many of them, interestingly, have been caused by sort of external shocks. But what that means is we have a whole range of issues that we can see from other countries need to be in place to really scale up adaptation, which just don't seem to be here at the moment. And I think there's a very interesting question on the right-hand side, which direction we go in next. And there's some real competing elements there that could be positive, but could also be negative. Some work that was published, which was myself and colleagues did, was some work that supported the last 2019 progress report, which looked at the governance issues, but also sort of went a little bit further. And what we were trying to do here was take and look at national policy and see that as a part of that national policy, whether or not adaptation had been factored in to the objectives, but also in terms of the theory of change and the logical framework that was delivering that policy change in that particular area. And what we found, you may not be surprised, is that we don't really see that really clear articulation of adaptation being translated through into policy making across government. And I think a really good example of that is the 25-year environment plan. You know, in theory, that was the perfect opportunity to really set out a long-term climate vision and actually try and encourage that long-term thinking. It was perfect for adaptation. I'd encourage you to have a look at that plan. I think it would be fair to say that the opportunity wasn't really realized. And again, there were a lot of reasons why that is. But as a very concrete example, resilience is mentioned in that 25-year environment plan in about 20 different areas. And it talks about increasing resilience, but what it doesn't do is set out how or what the objectives are and how resilience will actually be sort of considered to have been a success. But even more than that, it doesn't actually define what resilience is. And that leads to a really big question on how can you have a race to resilience when you can't even say what resilience is? And I think that's one of the fundamental issues we quite often face on the adaptation domain, is about trying to communicate objectives that we can get and recognizing that those objectives involve many, many other factors and also differ very strongly across existing policy areas. So a few things just to finish. I think there is a general observation that I might make that we're probably not investing enough in governance analysis. We did a little bit of governance analysis in CCRA 1, but we haven't really done it since. And I think that's a little bit of a gap. And also, I think if you read things like the National Adaptation Programme as an example, we don't really see those governance issues coming through. There's discussion about adaptive capacity that's starting to emerge, but in some respects, I think we're missing some of those governance elements that we know are important in delivering adaptation. And that really just leads me to my final issue, which is to say in respect to 3 degrees. 3 degrees probably will involve some degree of transformational adaptation. And what we mean by transformational adaptation is something that tries and thinks about doing different things as opposed to doing things differently. Normally it's associated with things such as systems thinking. And I think there's 2 issues here that are really important. One is that a lot of the transformational adaptation literature says in order to deliver this, you need new governance. And I think there's also an emerging question whether a mainstreaming modality itself, because it tends to conserve and push you back into existing systems, actually could be a barrier to transformational adaptation. And I think the final thing that I'll leave with is that we certainly need to be doing more evaluation. We sort of missed a trick in CCRA 2. I think we need to scale that up. And I think there's also a really interesting question about what governance changes we might need to actually step ahead and meet the challenge of a 3 degree future world. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our final panelist is Dr. Amal-Lee Amin, who's Director of Climate Change at the CDC Group. So Amal-Lee has 20 years in climate policy and finance, including roles for the Inter-American Development Bank, the think tank E3G, and prior to that working in UK government on sustainable energy and climate policy. In the Cabinet Office, DEFRA, the then Department of Energy and Climate Change, and the Foreign Office. So in 2019, she was recognised as one of the world's top 100 influencers on climate policy. And she started her present role as Director of Climate Change at CDC in February this year. So Amal-Lee's presentation focused on the adaptation financing challenge and barriers to investment in adaptation and resilience, and how these might be overcome, and how you might bring climate and resilience, climate risk and resilience into the project cycle. So hello, Amal-Lee. You haven't got a slide to share, so I'll stop sharing at this point.
Hi, thanks Kate, and thanks very much for the introduction here. So yes, I'm going to draw on some of my experience, particularly in the Latin American context at the Inter-American Development Bank, on some of the financing challenges, and in particular the role of governments in enabling and incentivizing private sector investment into adaptation and resilience. So I think, you know, when we look at the incentives for the private sector, I mean, they're really relatively limited in most cases. I think there's a wide perception that adaptation and resilience benefits are really providing public benefits, and much less so those private benefits that make them worthwhile investments on their own. However, when we look at the scale of investment that will be needed globally, whether we're in the UK, in any country, it becomes clear really that the public sector and governments and governance in particular, in light of the last presenter, will really need to start to build a much stronger collaboration and partnerships with the private sector to increase their participation, to bring in their finance, but I would say also their expertise as well in helping to manage some of the risks. And really that probably, I would say, the way I see it is three main challenges. In the presentation that hopefully people have had a chance to look at, I did a bit of a deep dive into how to increase investment, private investment into resilient infrastructure, which we know infrastructure, particularly as long-lived assets, noting the uncertainty over different climatic impacts over time, over the lifetime of the infrastructure. It becomes increasingly important to work through and ensure that climate risk, physical climate risk, is factored into the design, so very early on into the design of that infrastructure, and actually even sort of pre-design into the upstream governance arrangements. And in particular, where governments are looking to attract private sector investment, that climate risk is factored into the contractual arrangement, whether that's sort of direct public procurement or through a more public-private partnership type arrangement. And that it's really brought into the financial risk analysis. I think, in fact, I saw a question in the Q&A on that point, and it, it really does need to be thought through now beyond thinking about this as sort of an issue or a financial challenge that is the responsibility of the public sector, towards one where there is some sharing both of the risks as well as the responsibilities in managing and reducing the potential risks in terms of bringing that firmly into the business plan and into the financial risk assessment, as we're seeing is increasingly starting to happen. Some of you will probably be aware, or probably all of you be aware, of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. And since that emerged, it's become increasingly urgent, really, that both physical risk and also transition risk related to climate change is more fully addressed in a way to ensure that the private sector feels confident of investing. We see this, and it's an issue in many developing countries, in particular, this concern over capital, the risk of capital flight, i.e. that investors will perceive that a country or a sector within a country or particular types of investment, and I think infrastructure being probably the critical ones in many respects, that they will be, that the risks of physical risks of climate aren't being effectively managed. And so they'll actually, they'll increase the cost of capital to make it even more expensive to attract them. So it's really clear that governments now need to think this through carefully and ensure that they engage closely with the private sector, particularly as relates to infrastructure. But I think there are two other main areas that I didn't really have time to cover in the presentation in any detail, and I'll just say a few words about those. It's also, I think, important to recognise that traditional models of insurance are starting to break down, if you like, when we think about climate risk. However, insurance and the expertise of the insurance sector will still continue to have a very important role. But probably this needs to be thought through in the context of a wider fiscal agenda, i.e. what is the fiscal planning, management of a whole range of risks, including climate risk, by ministries of finance, by treasuries, and ensuring that this is fully integrated in a way that then the insurance sector can come in and help cover some residual risk, but it will need to be factored into the broader fiscal system. And so I think that's an area that we're starting to see emerging, and again, in my experience in Latin America, has become one that ministries of finance have really started to recognize as quite urgent, really, because, you know, for example, a very strong El Nino in Central America would lead to huge loss of GDP through loss of infrastructure. So it becomes clearly something that is the responsibility and a concern for the economy as a whole, and actually can really affect the overall growth prospects of that country. So really important to have leadership of ministries of finance in tackling and addressing these issues, and very much builds on the previous speakers, Paul's comments around governance and how to bring it in across all sectors, but also, I think, very importantly, the economic and financial sector. And then I would say the third main area where the private sector really needs to play a more important role is how to bring forward the more sort of the small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to be needed to provide the types of business solutions over time, whether that's supporting flood management, whether it's providing low carbon cooling. I mean, particularly when we think about heat stress, it's going to be very important to ensure that the cooling solutions are low carbon as well. And so all of these types of business services are likely to be needed in a local context, given obviously the contextual issue of adaptation needs. And so how can governments really incentivize and bring forward these markets and help ensure that what may be often quite early stage technologies, so businesses that are sort of more in the venture capital type space, how can they be accelerated? How can they be brought forward to start to provide those business solutions that will be needed, and also actually create jobs in local domestic contexts as well? So I think, you know, those three main areas all present very considerable challenges, if you like, but also potentially some opportunities. It will require governments to work very closely with the private sector across different types of private sector activity to build the collaboration, build those partnerships, provide the necessary data analysis and tools to really help attract and accelerate private sector investment across those three main areas. Thank you.
Many thanks, Amal-Lee. Great, so we're getting a lot of questions, and I encourage you to keep adding to this and to keep upvoting. So one that's been gaining a lot of interest has been one from Colin Church, who's very interested in Paul's presentation on governance, and from personal experience can confirm some of the issues that Paul's been raising. And he would like to ask the panel, so how would the panel modify the current governance arrangements to make adaptation a more vital part of government action and thinking? So it'd be great if the panelists could now put on their cameras so we can see you. And who would like to respond to that first question?
I guess it's a governance question, so I'm happy to answer, but I really think other panel members would be able to add something as well. I mean, I think the typical things that we would perhaps expect to see that would improve the governance. One is a very high level champion, which is normally involving a stronger, either a cabinet office or HMT, you know, Treasury. You need a much stronger convening government department to actually push things forward. And one of the things we observe in nearly every country is where the Ministry of Environment leads on climate change adaptation, you tend to get a relatively, the political economy or the political capital of that department tends to be quite low. So I think you need to restructure and see where this comes down from. And then if you do that, then what it enables you to do is to then integrate that in the budget cycle and the spending review round. So you then have an instant link through to financing as well. So you can then, you know, it comes from the ministry that does the budgeting and planning, and then it links through into the spending review cycle, and therefore it becomes part and parcel. So that's good. I mean, there's some things that we used to have. I think Catherine and I were joking about this. You know, 12 years ago, we had each department had its own adaptation plan, and there were cross-departmental working groups in place, and things have, for various reasons, those have sort of dripped down a little bit and don't really seem to be there. And then I guess, it's not, I think there is some value in having a longer term vision, and we've sort of lost that. So we had a 25-year environment plan, but we don't really have a 25-year climate plan. And we do have the equivalent for the sort of net zero that's determined and sort of going to help shape us in that respect. And there is perhaps an opportunity, and I know there was some discussion in DEFRA about that sort of longer term vision. And certainly the way that normally works is you have a long-term vision that then cascades through to medium-term planning and spending review cycles. So I think those 4 things to me seem relatively important, and certainly we observe those in other countries, but I'm sure the other panelists have got some additions as well.
Would anyone else like to respond to that? Yeah, Rob.
I'm definitely outside my comfort zone here in terms of commenting on this question, but again, putting perhaps a practical grassroots spin on the question, I think there's a lot that could be done to build the enabling environment to support local activity, local engagement. And it comes back to some quite basic things like free access to basic information, free of charge through user-friendly portals. So that's one particular area. And I think there's a whole raft of other things that can be done through policy interventions as well, which enable adaptation actions at the local level, whether it's in terms of refurbishing property or looking at standards for flood protection and so forth. There's lots that could be done, but I think what I'm saying here is I think we need both a grassroots, a bottom up and a top down view on governance.
Can I just add to that? Because I mean, I absolutely agree, and you need that local context. I think also it is important to bring in the private sector, because they're often much more effective at managing risk. I mean, that's what they do as the sort of primary, core to their business plan is look at risk and make decisions based on risk. And I think actually, bringing that in, whether at the local context or at a sort of, more in a planning context when thinking through, particularly around infrastructure, can really, could be really not just helpful, but actually necessary, important. And I think, going back to the point that, Paul said, from my experience in certainly in Latin America, you have ministries of finance are essential. Often in a developing country context, you often also have ministries of planning. And I think, how you, and planning is obviously so important, not just short-term sort of planning over, sort of particular bits of infrastructure, but thinking through longer-term planning and taking that spatial approach towards planning is essential. And if that's not core part of a government function, then you need to create that function somewhere.
Great, thank you. Anyone else like to comment on that? Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, just very briefly. I think there's obviously a lot of interest in just transition around mitigation options, but I'm wondering if there's a need for kind of some consideration of just a just adaptation commission. Maybe the CCC does this already, I'm not sure. And a wider engagement with citizens around this question. As I say, I think there's a gap there. Some of it has to happen at very local level. The local authorities and local stakeholders are working with the people who are at risk. But I think there's probably also a need for a more national level conversation about this as well. So that's kind of an add-on. You think of lots of other controversial areas like genomics, etc., and you always kind of have oversight stakeholder public ethics boards that look at some of the very, very knotty questions that come, should we have cloning or not? And the medical community have been doing this for many, many years. So, and I know again, CCC part covers that function, but maybe there's a wider remit to be covered there somewhere. Just a thought anyway.
Great, thank you, Nick. I think Catherine's got a comment to make here as well.
Yeah, I just try to respond to what Nick's just said. I mean, our remit is very narrow, in that we are only really resourced to report to government, central government and Parliament on adaptation in progress and on climate risks. So we don't even have a regional remit, let alone a public awareness raising remit. And although, as Paul was saying, a lot of that was in place with UK Climate Impacts Programme and then the Climate Ready Service over the last 10 years, that's been stripped away. And we mentioned that quite bluntly in our last progress report on the need to restart some of these support programmes and do what Rob was talking about with capacity building from the bottom up. And Nick, I'd very much agree with your want to have a climate assembly on adaptation to look at things like levels of acceptable risk. I think that'd be a really fascinating discussion and might kickstart much more of a regional focus as well.
And what I would add is it's not antithetical to the mitigation effort as well. I think the two can be done together. Both
absolutely
sides
agree.
of the same coin.
Okay, and that sort of links to the question that David Warrell brought up in the last session about is there an institutional gap, a public one-stop shop to promote adaptation, provide advice and to inform. I'm going to shift focus a little bit now. Another question that's getting a lot of interest is links to your talk, Rob. He agrees that indicators and monitoring adaptation outcomes are critical. But one problem that we've had is that good adaptation will be different at different levels of warming, and whether to enable persistence or current state or facilitate a change to a new one, for example, a new habitat, same habitat or a new one. So are there any ideas about how you might measure that?
Well, I think one of the points I forgot to make is that a key aspect of climate change indicators is that they support adaptive management. So ideally, as I think Jim Hall pointed out yesterday, we think through the portfolio of adaptation options ahead of time, what ultimately we're trying to achieve. And then we're using the climate change indicators to track the evolution of the threats and opportunities through time in relation to key trigger points at which we then say, right, we need to now follow this particular pathway or strategy to address this emergent threat. I mean, we can't just plan for one future and walk away from it. We have to approach this all in a very much an open-minded way. So we need lots of indicators tracking lots of vital statistics, not just our pulse rate, lots of things to get as I said before, a much more holistic view of how things are changing across the landscape as a whole, but being prepared to shift direction in the course of the adaptation, having thought that through ahead of time.
Okay. Anyone else like to comment on that one, Paul?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of I'm going to cheat a little bit and just highlight one thing I forgot to say, like Rob did. I mean, I think one thing I forgot to say on the last question is just to highlight that although I alluded to some of the sort of central government governance, I think there is this big issue that we haven't really done the regional and local governance and cascaded that down in the way that perhaps we should have done. I mean, it's an interesting observation, but when we started this 12 years ago, we had English regions, and we no longer do have English regions. And I think that, there is a big issue, a lot of literature around participatory and citizen-led decision-making that I think we really haven't dived into enough. And I think there is a big gap there, and certainly a lot of the literature says that that's a very important element for some of the more transformational adaptation things. The one thing I would highlight, and it links back to Rob's, just to sort of get a governance issue in, I'm really supportive of these sort of, these longer term and pathway type approaches, but we should be under no illusions. The governance for those is really challenging. Rob and I have been working together, and if you're trying to set up a 25 to 30 year governance arrangement to manage a project flexibly over time, you do have to work quite hard. You have to think about your institutional memory. You have to think about who holds the responsibility for when those decisions are taken and who makes those decisions. And I think there is a gap there in terms of thinking through the implications and the governance arrangements for some of the things that we would like to do, because it in practice is not quite as simple as we hoped.
Yeah.
Can I maybe just add to that, because again, I mean, drawing on experience from the developing world, often where you have national development banks, I know there's a lot of talk about a possible national infrastructure bank here in the UK. That can be, those institutions can be really critical in actually taking that sort of longer term approach, and in particular going back to the point I made about how you manage the risk between the public and the private sector, and in a way that it is probably more appropriate to do that through a financial institution than necessarily through directly off the government's balance sheet. And and I think that point about the institutional memory is really important, and it's memory, but also ensuring that when you negotiate the contracts for particularly infrastructure with the private sector, assuming the private sector is involved, that you've got you've factored in all these different potential risks, maybe contingent risks that may take place over time, and that you deal with those as early on as possible, recognizing, of course, though, there will always be uncertainty, but also that insurance is unlikely to be unlikely to step in. For the whole concept of force majeure now has been reopened in light of climate risk. So that needs to be dealt with upfront, and you need to define what you mean by an unacceptable risk versus a risk that you think may manifest. It may become material, even you don't know for sure. So I think you're right. It's that institutional memory, but it's also institutional capacity now to be able to engage effectively, particularly I would say with the private sector, who are actually much better generally at managing risk, on the whole.
Rob, do you want to come back on that?
No, I completely agree with it in terms of the institutional memory and the longevity of organisations to see through these plans. I think that's a critical factor, and we see these sorts of issues emerging in major efforts such as in the Murray-Darling water plan, looking at readjusting water allocation over decades over time and into the future. But another point I forgot to make was in terms of how do we adapt for a radically different type of future. I think we can always come back to the old adage of reducing all of the other pressures, non-climatic pressures on systems, whether human or natural, that are within our control. So I think the point was made very clearly this morning that if we reduce pressures from pollution, water quality, over abstraction and such like on natural systems, they're going to be in a better shape to adapt to whatever the future climate may hold. So where feasible, those come under a category of low regret measures, and we shouldn't lose sight of those.
Okay, thank you, Rob. I'm just going to ask a question that's been coming up throughout the day, I think, and a bit yesterday, about targets. And is it desirable to have a target for adaptation? Is it realistic to have an adaptation target? And what might that look like? And just to get anybody's responses on that, would it be useful? Would it be motivating? Or what do people think? Paul?
Just in the absence of everyone, I think we're all trying to duck that question. So I think we need to differentiate what we mean in terms of the target, and I think whether this is an equivalent of a net zero target or whether it's a target that reflects to specific risks or sectors. And I always look at the adaptation gap report series by UNEP was very instrumental in trying and failing, and I think being honest about failing in trying to set global adaptation targets. And I think that exercise was a real, they had their sort of emissions gap report and thought, well, let's just do it for adaptation. and you know, brought the great and the good together and sort of failed. And I think that's important to recognise that it's just really difficult to define a target that everyone will agree to. And so we should be under no illusions about that. So I'm, you know, personally, I think the concept of an equivalence to the race to resilience is very challenging to do, but what you can do is you can crowd in initiatives and try and, you know, signal a direction of travel. Whether you can get targets for individual risks or areas, absolutely, but then you're not, you know, you have to think then about those targets being different to a sort of unified and common metric that we have in, say, the mitigation domain. So they would be appropriate to you know, the way that we consider objectives and targets set in a particular area now, and what we as a society would be prepared to do in terms of trading off the costs and the residual risks towards action. But so I think, you know, anyone who's worked in adaptation for any time will tell you that trying to get, you know, indicators and outcomes for adaptation is very, very challenging, which is why we have so many process-based adaptation outcomes and indicators, and rather than, you know, very specific targets. And I think it's really valuable to look at that again, but, you know, it's a real challenge, and I think it's important to learn why we haven't been able to do it before, and think about maybe what could be relevant. But, you know, so saying it's difficult isn't really an easy answer. It doesn't tell you anything, but I think it is important to learn from exercises that have not succeeded, and see what maybe we can do within the space of what's possible. But.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, this morning I think we saw a really nice example of an adaptation vision. So it was this graphic showing what a future urban scene might look like. And what struck me from that graphic was it catered to all sorts of constituencies. So there were elements of flood risk management, water harvesting, habitat creation, comfort and health of the built environment. And it might come across as rather simplistic to present a vision in a cartoon way, but I actually think there's a lot of power in that. And whether collectively as a nation we could draw what the UK cartoon would look like, what would we hope for as the future through all this adaptation effort, taking in mind also, you know, leaving no one behind, not increasing inequalities within society. What would that vision look like if we had to draw it? I think that would be quite a fascinating exercise.
Great. Anyone else like to respond on that one? No? Okay, another question that seems to be getting a lot of interest is from Robert Proctor. So we seem to be obsessed with offering hope to people, and often this doesn't reflect reality and potentially makes it difficult to face up to the problems and address them. But how can we actually communicate the issue without needing to offer false hope and support people to recognise and accept the huge changes we're likely to see, and engage them in a discussion about what we can do to address this? And I know, Nick, in the survey that you did, there was questions around anxiety and things like that. So it'd be really interesting to get your response to this question around hope.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, and it's difficult because there's plenty of evidence, as I think I mentioned, that fear, telling people that it's just going to be really bad doesn't necessarily motivate everybody to do the right thing. And it may well be that there are other constraints on people's behavior for change. There'll be institutional constraints on how much a devolved administration could do, for example. However, I mean, all the evidence suggests that you do have to, hope's the wrong word, isn't it? If you're really going to tell people there's a bad risk coming along the line, in some respects, you've got to either support them to deal with that if there's no way out of it, or you've got to demonstrate that there are things that can be done or that are being done across the board, or that they can do themselves to, in some sense, either mitigate or remove or reduce the risk. And I think that's the dilemma. It's getting across And there were also some questions about, well, shouldn't we present this as a dynamic question rather than 2 versus 4? But the moment you start thinking about that, it's like thinking about the workings of the human body, because it's, you know, dynamic by, you know, 4 by when, what would happen next, how fast is it changing, all of that stuff. That becomes a very difficult conversation to have. So I think the balance, there are plenty of things we should be doing, both on adaptation and mitigation. That's pretty clear, isn't it? And there's plenty of things that we can do. So it's, the question then is constructing the narrative around, this could well get very bad, but these are the things that as a society that we've got to do. And, you know, I hate to come back to our current situation, but broadly, that's what's had to happen over the current pandemic. And you can see, I mean, notwithstanding, there have been a lot of mixed messages going on, and the communication is not as good as it could have been. Nonetheless, both of those things have had to be dealt with in having that conversation with people about how to avoid the risk. So I think it's getting the balance between both. I come back to the adaptation citizens assembly. You know, it would just be really, and it's not a plug to do more research or anything like that, although there is a research gap here, clearly. It would be really interesting to rerun that, but focusing more on climate risk and trying to understand the really difficult things that people are having great difficulty dealing with or understanding, or where they disagree with experts for legitimate, you know, the expert analysis for legitimate reasons. And I think that would be one way to sort of start to approach that conversation a little bit. But I know there's no straightforward answer. It's such a good question. There's no straightforward answer to it, I think, at our current level of knowledge.
Can I come on? Yeah, just on that point, but also the point that Rob made. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join this morning, so I didn't see the cartoon, which sounds great. But I think also you only have to look at cities particularly cities in other contexts, where actually there are some really quite inspiring examples of how resiliency has been built in, particularly using nature-based solutions. So for example, I mean, in Latin America, Medellin, which in Colombia is one of a city that's won actually awards for the use of natural green corridors to both reduce potential flooding, but also provide natural cooling. I think everyone's probably, well, most people are probably aware that since the very intense heat waves in Europe in, I think, around 2004, Paris has put in place a lot of these natural green cooling spaces where, I mean, we're fortunate here in London that we already have quite good parks and green spaces, but particularly in an urban context, we know that concrete is very bad for urban heat effect, but also it's very bad from a flooding point of view. And again, this is something I came across in my work in Latin America, the concept of sponge cities, how you put in place green reservoirs to really, absorb more water, and so less concrete, more green spaces, specifically designed in, particularly vulnerable cases to actually take rainwater runoff. And I think goes back to that point that Rob made, that you can actually, some of the solutions are actually going to tick many different boxes, create much more pleasant environments to live, particularly in the urban context. And actually we need to, I think, focus more on those and build sort of strong demand for those types of solutions, because they can really provide not just hope, but actually a much cleaner, pleasant biodiverse environment, whilst also helping to reduce many of the threats, whether it's heat or flooding, that are going to be faced in the future.
Right, thanks, Emily. I've got a specific question for you now, Emily. Sorry to keep you going on this, but so it's for Paul Mundy. It's designing in physical climate risk into infrastructure typically increases capex. And the resulting potential benefits in reduced OPEX are not typically reflected in financial models. What initiatives have you seen that attempt to capture the financial benefits of adaptation investments? Because this seems quite important to help stimulate public and private sector investments. So what do you hear about?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely one of the key challenges. And, you know, again, going back to some of the work I did in my previous role at the Inter-American Development Bank, we were looking at this in different ways. So, for example, partnering with the government of Jamaica and actually their National Development Bank to look at how climate risk was integrated into their public-private partnership framework, and looking at these issues of, you know, ensuring that risks are core to the physical climate risk is core to the business case. And I just want to sort of to emphasize that typically up until fairly recently, whether a multilateral development bank or a national development bank or government context, environmental issues, including climate, have tended to be considered as part of an environmental social action plan. That tends to look at the potential impacts, the negative impacts of, if that project fails, what are the negative, because of, say, a hurricane or, you know, some kind of climatic event, if that project fails, what are the negative impacts on the local communities and environment? Of course, that's very, very important. But what hasn't been done, and is only now starting to be done, is actually how is integrating physical risk into the economic viability of that project. I mean, it's essential, and it sounds kind of obvious, but it's kind of you know, quite a new sort of innovative, if you like, approach towards this. And as you do so and look at it within the context of the viability of that project over its life cycle, then you start to get into these issues of what the OPEX issues may be, and how if you build in more resiliency up front, you can reduce the OPEX. And I suppose this gets to the heart of what I was saying, of that you need to integrate these issues into your contractual arrangements when trying to bring in the private sector. So that's, like, I would say, you know, fundamental to that.
Okay, thank you, Amal-Lee. So I think I'd like to shift to a question now from David Warrilow, where I think he says, I think there's a fundamental problem with the whole climate change narrative, which splits adaptation and mitigation. And as it's been said, that there's a view that if we achieve net zero, then the problem's solved. But of course, that's not true. We still have to adapt to 2 degrees C. So the message has to be that to deal with climate change, we need to reduce emissions and achieve net zero and adapt. So what do people think about that, sort of bringing together to be able to address this effectively? We need to do that more effectively so that it's not sort of split across policy domains. Any responses? Catherine?
I feel slightly bad doing this because I'm not a panelist, but I do have experience. Having worked in a joint adaptation mitigation team, and then having worked in an adaptation team separate from a mitigation team. And Amal-Lee will remember this because we worked together back in 2003, 2004 in the DEFRA team that had everything joined together. I think, and DEFRA colleagues who have joined might say the same thing. It's been quite tough to have adaptation in DEFRA and to have mitigation separated and sitting in DEC and then BAYS. Because every time you want to do anything integrated, you have to have a very lengthy discussion with different groups of officials about attempting to do this. And those groups of officials are all being pulled in different directions, and more often than not, it's not really possible to achieve. Whereas I'd say, and Amal-Lee, you might want to bring in some historic experience on this. I think when we were all integrated into one team and all sat together in one building, it was better in terms of being able to do that join up. And David was there heading our climate science team at the time as well. So, you know, that takes a big governance change in government to do that. And also you don't want that to happen and then for adaptation to be lost completely. So that's the benefit of having it separated, is actually it does have its own voice and you protect that. But that, yeah, I just wanted to do a bit of scene setting, and Amal-Lee, you might want to pick up on that point.
Yeah, no, I think that's obviously a key part of the governance challenge. And I was, you know, I think also going back to Paul's point about, is mainstreaming actually the way to go? I mean, I was quite interested to hear that, because the way I tend to see it is that we need to ensure resiliency of everything we do. And I'm thinking more about, you know, sort of investments, public, private investments, as well as deliver resiliency through specific investments that are designed to specifically deliver on adaptation. And, you know, it's the former where the sort of mitigation and the adaptation really should be, you know, come closely together. You can't do, you know, we have a good example actually, CDC in Pakistan, where we invested in a wind power farm in Pakistan, which actually was on a floodplain. So what we did, we actually worked with, and very much working with the local communities as well, to restore the mangroves, which have actually brought a lot of social benefits as well in terms of improve, you know, fisheries, crabbing, etc., creating, you know, jobs for local communities. And, you know, and that mangrove restoration is providing resiliency to that wind farm. You know, appreciate, you know, looking at it at an asset level, at a single project level, you know, it sort of sounds simple, but I think this issue, as, you know, as Catherine referred to, that, you know, generally governments work in silos, you know, sector ministries work in silos, and that's very much, and it kind of goes back to the point I made about, you know, my experience in Latin America, where governments actually had ministries of planning that specifically focus on trying to join up the dots and work across those silos. You know, that's kind of their, you know, one of their main functions, and that helps a lot, I would say. But, you know, often, most countries certainly in Europe, here in the UK, we don't tend to have ministries of planning anymore, but that function is really, really important.
Okay, I'm quite aware we have a very hard stop because we've got the Secretary of State coming up, so there's a couple of minutes for any other responses. So we've got Rob and Nick. So Rob, would you like to go first? Oh, and Paul.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Kate. Yeah, just the obvious points in terms of bringing those two streams together is in order to reconcile trade-offs and to also enjoy co-benefits of aligning those two worlds. And I'm in the fortunate position of having to help Loughborough University think through a climate change strategy over the next 12 months. And one of the things on the list is travel policy. So a university travel policy obviously has a lot of benefit in terms of taking us towards lower emissions, but we also have to look at the fabric and the wear and tear and the impacts on the regional network of extreme weather. And you can't come up with a proper travel policy at grassroots level of even a campus without bringing those two worlds together. So again, just sort of making it really practical here.
Yeah, great, Nick.
Yeah, and I'll just say briefly, the report which Climate Outreach did for us anyway, on policy recommendations from the survey, made a clear recommendation. There really wasn't a danger in bringing the two together. The public just see climate change as a very difficult, messy problem that people ought to be getting on with. So whether it's a scientific or policy distinction between the two, that doesn't really matter to the general public. I think that, and we asked about, you know, what should government be prioritising, and people thought both, actually, to be honest. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, I think there's a logic to sort of centralising them within a sort of government department, that sort of. At the same time, I mean, one of the things that we've started to see is we have very strong long-term visions developing for the low carbon side now with net zero. There's been a lot of talk in the European Commission about mission-led initiatives, and also particularly mission-led initiatives on adaptation, and some of that does look quite interesting. And I think there is perhaps a little bit more opportunity to link those long-term visions together. Otherwise you end up, I mean, you do sort of end up with net zero crowding out a little bit more on the adaptation side. But also at the same point, I think it is worth highlighting that, you know, we have traditionally done adaptation and mitigation in practical terms in very different ways. And adaptation does tend to sort of spill over into lots of other multiple issues. And so I think there may come a point where maybe this is the bit I'm trying to say, you should probably mainstream your way to 2 degrees without any problem. I think that's probably possible. You certainly can't mainstream your way to 4 degrees in terms of adaptation. So at some point, I think we are going to have to recognize that we're going to do more, and that might be the catalyst that sort of spills us over and says, actually, we really need to think about these a little bit more together.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, everyone. We've got lots of questions, and I feel quite like we haven't had enough time. We've got over 40 questions, some of which we've been able to address. And I hope we'll find some way of answering some of the remaining ones. So I'm just going to draw it together. Our task was about trying to address the governance, awareness, data, cultural, political changes that need to be made. And I guess some of the key things that I've been hearing is that, yeah, there are some very positive things in place. We've got some quite solid adaptation governance architecture. We've got the task force on climate related financial disclosure. We've got some good long-term records and things, and the British public is largely supportive of adaptation policies. There's a recognition that the psychological distance is reduced, and people recognise that this is serious and it's happening. So that there are some positives and some strong drivers, but something Paul was saying is not working, and more needs to be done, and that is partly around sort of as Catherine and Baroness Brown mentioned this morning. This is a really messy problem, and it's complex, and there are many players involved, and that requires adequate governance. And it requires sort of coordination and some sense of sort of a joint activity, and if that doesn't happen, there will be this kind of this dearth of action will continue, and that the monitoring and the evaluation of that progress is essential, because you need to be able to pick up signals of change, and you also need to be learning and improving over time. And certainly what came out very strongly this morning, I thought, was around, and we sort of did touch on it a bit just now, about the need to talk about trade-offs, to think about how this impacts different groups in society and who pays and who benefits from this, and that thinking about resilience is about addressing other issues around employment, quality of housing and things like that. And we need to have ways of thinking about how to create these joint visions. These could be very positive visions, but how do we actually have those national conversations about what kind of levels of risk are acceptable, what constitutes an acceptable loss? That might be loss of a habitat, a landscape, a species, or a level of service. How do we start to have these conversations? And Robert Nichols this morning also talked about that resilience is something that you negotiate, and you need to bring people together and to have those conversations. So how do we do that? And maybe we can be learning things from COVID around how we responded to COVID, about how to do that, or how not to do it. So yeah, I guess my feeling is that it's really difficult to set these targets, but without them, and without some kind of clear framework, or I think Paul talked about a theory of change in his presentation. Without that, how are we going to any response is likely to be more efficient, inefficient, inadequate, hard to embed, and sort of a lack of clarity about who's responsible for delivering it. And yeah, I mean, I guess just to echo Paul's final point about, yeah, we can adapt incrementally to 2 degrees, but more than that, we need something more transformational. So just remains for me to say thank you very, very much to the panelists. I'm sorry we had such a short time, we're just getting into it about, and thanks for all the work you put into the presentations ahead of time. Lots of valuable contributions there, and I encourage people to look at those. So all very much appreciated.